The rain fell in torrents against the towering glass facade of Blackwood Industries, each droplet a crystalline messenger of the tempest that raged both without and within the marble halls of corporate power. It was upon such a morning, grey and forbidding as the countenance of fate itself, that Evangeline Gray found herself standing before the mahogany doors of the executive suite, her heart beating with the irregular rhythm of one who stands upon the precipice of destiny. She had been warned, of course. The whispers followed her through the sterile corridors like shadows at twilight, tales of assistants who had entered that sanctum with hope burning bright in their breasts, only to emerge weeks later, their spirits broken, their confidence shattered upon the unforgiving rocks of Alexander Blackwood's impossible standards. Some spoke in hushed tones of nervous breakdowns, of tears shed in empty conference rooms, of resignations submitted with trembling hands. Others, possessed of a more theatrical disposition, declared that the man was cursed, that no mortal soul could endure the tempestuous nature of his demands for longer than the moon's cycle. Yet here stood Evangeline, her chin lifted with that peculiar species of determination that belongs only to those who have known adversity as an intimate companion. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe chignon that spoke of practicality rather than fashion, and her grey eyes, those windows to a soul that had weathered storms more fierce than any corporate boardroom could conjure, surveyed the opulent surroundings with neither awe nor intimidation. She had not come to this place seeking glory or ease, but from necessity as sharp and unforgiving as winter's blade. The receptionist, a woman of middle years whose countenance bore the weary expression of one who had witnessed too many hopeful souls march toward their professional doom, regarded Evangeline with a mixture of pity and resignation. "Mr. Blackwood will see you now," she murmured, her voice carrying the weight of a funeral bell. "God help you, dear." Through those mahogany doors lay a realm that seemed to exist apart from the natural order of things. The office sprawled before her like a testament to human ambition, its windows offering a panoramic view of the city that sprawled below like a conquered territory. Yet, it was not the grandeur of the space that commanded attention, but rather the man who occupied it with the casual authority of a monarch in his throne room. Alexander Blackwood stood silhouetted against the storm-darkened sky, his tall frame motionless as carved granite, his dark hair catching the intermittent flashes of lightning that illuminated his profile. When he turned to face her, Evangeline found herself confronted with features that might have been sculpted by some Renaissance master obsessed with the terrible beauty of fallen angels. His jaw was strong and uncompromising, his nose aquiline and aristocratic, but it was his eyes that truly arrested her attention. Those dark orbs that seemed to hold within their depths all the accumulated cynicism and ruthless calculation of a man who had scaled the heights of power by trampling upon the dreams of lesser mortals. "Miss Gray," he said, and his voice possessed that peculiar quality that belongs to those accustomed to absolute obedience, smooth as silk, yet edged with steel. "I trust you understand that your predecessors have proven inadequate to the demands of this position." She met his gaze without flinching, though she felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical force. "I am not my predecessors, Mr. Blackwood." A ghost of something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. "Indeed, and what makes you believe you possess qualities that they lacked?" "Perhaps," she replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "It is not a matter of what I possess, but rather what I do not. I do not come to you seeking validation or approval. I come seeking employment, and I'm prepared to earn it through competence rather than charm." The silence that followed her words stretched between them like a taut wire, electric with unspoken challenge. Alexander moved with the fluid grace of a predator, circling his massive desk to stand before her, close enough that she could perceive the subtle fragrance of his cologne, something expensive and masculine that seemed to embody power itself. "Your resume is adequate," he said, though his tone suggested that adequacy was barely worthy of his notice. A degree from a respectable university, experience in corporate environments, references that speak to your reliability. He pronounced the word as though it were somehow distasteful. Tell me, Miss Gray, what drives you? What ambition burns within your breast that brings you to seek employment with a man whom gossip paints as impossible to please? The question hung in the air between them, and Evangeline felt the strange sensation that her answer would determine far more than merely her employment prospects. She thought of the mounting bills that awaited her attention, of the small apartment she shared with her ailing grandmother, of the dreams she had set aside in favor of survival's harsh arithmetic. "Necessity, Mr. Blackwood," she replied simply. "I require this position not for the advancement of my career or the satisfaction of my pride, but because I have responsibilities that cannot be set aside for the sake of comfort or convention." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise perhaps, or recognition. "How refreshingly honest," he murmured, "and how utterly naive. Do you truly believe that necessity alone will sustain you when faced with demands that have broken stronger spirits than yours?" "I believe," she said, meeting his challenging gaze with unwavering resolve, "that necessity has already forged me in fires far hotter than any corporate environment could provide. I've endured poverty, illness, and disappointment. I've worked 3 jobs while completing my education, and I've learned that survival requires not merely strength, but adaptability. Whatever trials this position may offer, I assure you they cannot exceed those I have already overcome." The storm outside seemed to intensify, as though nature herself recognized the significance of this moment. Lightning illuminated the office in stark relief, casting dramatic shadows that danced across Alexander's features as he studied her with the intensity of a scientist examining some fascinating new specimen. "Very well," he said at length, returning to his position behind the desk with movements that spoke of barely contained energy. "You shall have your opportunity to prove these bold claims. But understand this, Miss Gray. I do not tolerate incompetence, tardiness, or emotional displays. I require absolute dedication, unquestioning obedience, and the ability to anticipate my needs before I voice them. You will be available at all hours, responsive to my demands regardless of personal inconvenience, and prepared to handle tasks that range from the mundane to the impossible." He paused, his dark eyes fixed upon her face, as though seeking some sign of weakness or hesitation. Finding none, he continued, "Your salary will be commensurate with these expectations, generous enough to ensure your complete devotion to this position. In return, I expect nothing less than perfection. You shall have it," Evangeline replied without hesitation, though inwardly she marveled at the strange mixture of trepidation and exhilaration that coursed through her veins. Thus began what the office gossips would later describe as the most tumultuous and unlikely partnership in the company's history. From that first day, Alexander Blackwood seemed determined to test every limit of human endurance and capability, as though he were conducting some elaborate experiment to determine the precise breaking point of the human spirit. The days blurred together in a relentless parade of impossible deadlines, cryptic instructions, and demands that would have taxed the patience of Job himself. Alexander required his coffee at precisely 7:30 each morning, prepared according to specifications so exacting that they resembled a scientific formula more than a beverage preference. His schedule changed with the capricious frequency of spring weather, and Evangeline found herself constantly rearranging meetings, placating frustrated executives, and performing feats of diplomatic magic that would have impressed Metternich himself. Yet, with each passing day, she began to perceive patterns within the apparent chaos, method within the seeming madness. Alexander's demands, though excessive, were not arbitrary. His standards, though impossibly high, were applied with rigorous consistency. Slowly, she began to understand that his legendary difficulty stemmed not from cruelty or caprice, but from a perfectionism so absolute that it bordered on the pathological. She watched him work with the focused intensity of a master craftsman, his brilliant mind dissecting complex problems with surgical precision, his decisions affecting the livelihoods of thousands with the casual authority of divine decree. Yet she also observed moments when the mask slipped, brief glimpses of something vulnerable beneath the armor of arrogance and control. A photograph on his desk, hastily covered when she entered the room unexpectedly. A phone call that left him staring out the window with an expression of profound melancholy. These instances were fleeting as summer lightning, but they revealed depths to his character that contradicted his carefully cultivated image of invulnerable authority. As the days passed into weeks, Evangeline found herself adapting to the peculiar rhythm of his world with an ease that surprised even herself. She learned to read the subtle signs that preceded his moods, the slight tightening around his eyes that signaled impatience, the drumming of his fingers that indicated deep thought, the particular quality of silence that meant a decision of great importance was taking shape within his mind. More unsettling still, she began to detect signs that her presence was having an unexpected effect upon him. Where once his instructions had been delivered with the cold precision of a military commander, she now caught glimpses of something approaching consideration. When she worked late into the evening, she would sometimes find coffee appearing at her desk, not the utilitarian office brew, but the expensive blend reserved for his private use. When she mentioned in passing her concern for her grandmother's health, he had quietly arranged for the company's medical plan to extend coverage to family members of senior staff. These small gestures might have been dismissed as mere employer courtesy, but Evangeline possessed that particular species of feminine intuition that perceives truth beneath surface appearances. She sensed that Alexander Blackwood was as bewildered by his own behavior as she was, that some fundamental shift was occurring within the carefully ordered landscape of his existence. The first major test of their unlikely partnership came during the 4th week of her employment, when a crisis erupted that threatened to destroy a multi-million-dollar deal with a temperamental European client. The details were complex, involving cultural misunderstandings, legal complications, and a series of miscommunications that had escalated into what diplomats might euphemistically term a delicate situation. Alexander's response was characteristic, a display of controlled fury that would have reduced lesser mortals to quivering submission. His voice remained level, his posture composed, but Evangeline could see the storm raging beneath the surface, the tension that coiled through his frame like electricity seeking ground. "Cancel my appointments," he commanded, his dark eyes fixed upon some invisible enemy. "Arrange a conference call with Munich and have the legal team standing by. This disaster will not be permitted to unfold on my watch." For the next 18 hours, the office became a theater of war, with Alexander orchestrating a campaign of negotiation, compromise, and strategic maneuvering that displayed his abilities at their most formidable. Evangeline found herself serving as his lieutenant in this battle, anticipating his needs, managing communications, and somehow maintaining order amid the chaos of conflicting demands and impossible deadlines. It was during the darkest hour of this crisis, when failure seemed not merely possible, but inevitable, that she witnessed something that would forever alter her understanding of the man she served. A call came through on his private line, one of those communications that he always answered regardless of circumstances. She watched his face transform as he listened, saw the corporate warrior replaced by something infinitely more human and vulnerable. "I understand," he said quietly into the phone, his voice carrying a weight of sorrow that seemed to emanate from the very depths of his soul. "No, there's nothing more to be done. I'll be there as soon as I can arrange it." When he ended the call, he sat in silence for a long moment, his head bowed as though bearing the weight of the world upon his shoulders. Then, with visible effort, he straightened and met her eyes. "My father is dying," he said simply. "I must leave immediately." The words struck her like a physical blow, not merely for their content, but for the way they revealed the man behind the mask. In that moment, She saw not the formidable CEO who commanded fear and respect in equal measure, but simply a son facing the imminent loss of his father. "The Munich situation," he began, but she interrupted him with a gesture. "Will be handled," she said with quiet confidence. "Go to your father, Mr. Blackwood. Some things transcend business." He studied her face with an intensity that seemed to penetrate to her very soul, as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time. "You would take responsibility for this negotiation. The company stands to lose millions if it fails." "Then it will not fail," she replied simply. "Trust me." The word hung between them with the weight of revelation. Trust, such a simple concept, yet one that Alexander Blackwood had seemingly excised from his vocabulary long ago. She could see the war being fought behind his eyes, the struggle between his need for control and his growing recognition of her competence. "Very well," he said at last, and in those two words, she heard the sound of walls beginning to crumble. "I leave this matter in your capable hands, Miss Gray. Do not make me regret this decision." As he gathered his things and prepared to leave, pausing at the door as though on the verge of saying something more, Evangeline felt the strange conviction that this moment marked a turning point not merely in their professional relationship, but in something far more profound and dangerous. She was beginning to care for this difficult, brilliant, impossibly complicated man, and she suspected that he was experiencing a similar transformation. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving her alone in the vast office with its panoramic views and the weight of enormous responsibility settling upon her shoulders like a mantle. Outside, the storm had finally passed, and the first tentative rays of sunlight were beginning to pierce the clouds, casting everything in shades of gold and promise. The days that followed Alexander's departure passed like scenes from some fevered dream, wherein Evangeline found herself thrust into a role for which no amount of preparation could have sufficed. The Munich crisis loomed before her like a mountain to be scaled without rope or compass, yet she approached it with the methodical determination that had sustained her through countless trials. The European client, Herr Zimmermann, possessed all the charm and flexibility of Prussian steel, his voice crackling through the international connection with the authority of one accustomed to absolute deference. His English, though precise, carried undertones of disdain that spoke volumes about his opinion of dealing with subordinates in matters of such magnitude. "I was promised direct communication with Mr. Blackwood himself," he declared during their first conversation, his words delivered with the cutting precision of a rapier thrust. "This arrangement is most irregular, and I fear it does not inspire confidence in your organization's commitment to our partnership." Evangeline felt the familiar stirring of that flame which had sustained her through years of condescension and dismissal. Not anger precisely, but something far more potent, the quiet resolve of one who has learned to transmute insult into strength. "Mr. Blackwood entrusted this matter to my care because he recognizes that the situation requires someone capable of providing the personal attention and flexibility that corporate hierarchies often impede," she replied, her voice carrying the cool authority she had learned to cultivate. "I assure you, Herr Zimmermann, that his confidence in my abilities is not misplaced." What followed was a negotiation that would have challenged the diplomatic skills of Talleyrand himself. The contract, she discovered, had been derailed not by any fundamental disagreement over terms or compensation, but by a series of cultural misunderstandings that had accumulated like sediment in a once clear stream. The German client felt insulted by what he perceived as American brashness and disregard for proper protocol, while the American legal team had interpreted his formal communication style as hostile inflexibility. Hour by hour, Evangeline worked to unravel these tangled threads of miscommunication. She studied German business customs with the intensity of a scholar preparing for crucial examinations, consulted with cultural liaisons, and slowly began to build bridges across the chasm of wounded pride and commercial anxiety. Her approach was neither Alexander's commanding presence nor the obsequious accommodation that others might have employed, but something uniquely her own, a synthesis of respect, competence, and quiet authority that seemed to resonate with the German executive's sensibilities. "You are most unusual, Miss Grey," Herr Zimmermann observed during one of their lengthy conversations, his tone carrying a note of grudging approval. "In my experience, Americans in business are either too aggressive or too accommodating. You display neither weakness." "Perhaps," she replied, "it is because I have learned that true strength lies not in domination or submission, but in understanding the needs of all parties and finding solutions that honor those needs without compromising essential principles." The breakthrough came during the 5th day of negotiations, when what appeared to be an insurmountable technical disagreement threatened to destroy weeks of careful diplomatic work. The German firm required modifications to their manufacturing process that would necessitate significant additional costs, while the American side balked at expenses they viewed as unnecessary perfectionism. It was then that Evangeline's unique perspective, forged in the crucible of personal hardship and necessity, provided the insight that had eluded more experienced negotiators. She recognized that both parties were essentially correct within the context of their respective priorities, and that the solution lay not in compromise, but in creative restructuring. "What if," she proposed, during a conference call that included representatives from both sides, "we approach this not as a modification to existing terms, but as a partnership opportunity? Your technical requirements represent an investment in long-term quality that could become a selling point for the American market. Rather than viewing these costs as additional expenses, we could structure them as shared investments in product development, with corresponding adjustments to the profit-sharing arrangements." The silence that followed her proposal stretched like a held breath, and she felt the peculiar sensation of having stepped onto ground that might prove either solid or treacherous. Then Herr Zimmermann's voice came through the connection, carrying a warmth that had been notably absent from their previous exchanges. "Miss Grey," he said, "this is precisely the sort of innovative thinking that our partnership requires. You have transformed an obstacle into an opportunity." By the time Alexander returned from his father's funeral, an event about which he spoke not at all, though the shadows beneath his eyes and the new lines of grief etched upon his features told their own story, the Munich contract had been not merely salvaged, but substantially improved. The final agreement included provisions for expanded cooperation, increased profitability for both parties, and a framework for future collaboration that exceeded even the most optimistic initial projections. He stood in his office doorway for a long moment after learning of these developments, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that seemed to penetrate to her very essence. The formal suit of mourning lent him an air of austere dignity that emphasized the sharp planes of his face and the controlled power of his bearing. "You have exceeded expectations, Miss Grey," he said at length, his voice carrying undertones she could not quite decipher. "The board is particularly impressed with the innovative profit-sharing structure. How did you conceive of such an approach?" "It seemed logical," she replied, though she sensed that her answer had somehow disappointed him. Both parties possessed legitimate concerns that appeared irreconcilable until viewed from a different perspective. "Logical," he repeated, and something in his tone suggested that logic alone could not account for the diplomatic miracle she had accomplished. He moved to his desk with movements that seemed weighted with more than physical fatigue, settling into his chair with the careful precision of one who has learned to carry grief as a private burden. The days that followed revealed subtle but unmistakable changes in their dynamic. Where once Alexander had maintained absolute professional distance, she now detected occasional glimpses of something approaching personal interest. He began to ask questions that went beyond the immediate requirements of business, inquiring about her background, her education, the circumstances that had brought her to his employ. "You mentioned responsibilities that necessitated this position," he said one evening as they worked late to prepare for a board presentation. The office was bathed in the golden light of sunset, and the city sparkled below them like a jeweled tapestry. "Are these family obligations?" The personal nature of the question surprised her, coming as it did from a man who had previously shown no interest in the private lives of his employees. She hesitated, uncertain whether his inquiry represented genuine concern or merely idle curiosity. "My grandmother," she replied carefully. "She raised me after my parents died, and she now requires care that exceeds her modest pension's capacity to provide." He absorbed this information in silence, his fingers drumming against the mahogany surface of his desk in that particular rhythm she had learned to associate with deep thought. "And your parents? What circumstances led to your grandmother assuming their responsibilities?" The question opened doors in her memory that she habitually kept locked, revealing chambers filled with loss and longing that she rarely allowed herself to explore. "A car accident when I was 16, she said simply, though the simplicity of the words concealed depths of grief and upheaval that had shaped every aspect of her subsequent existence. "I see," he murmured, and in those two words she heard the recognition of one who had recently walked through similar valleys of loss. "And you have been caring for her since that time?" "She cared for me first," Evangeline replied, surprised by the defensive note that crept into her voice. "It is a privilege to return that kindness, not a burden." Alexander's eyes met hers with an intensity that seemed to illuminate the space between them. "You speak of privilege in circumstances that most would describe as sacrifice. This is either admirable nobility or dangerous self-deception." "Perhaps," she said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks, "it is simply the practical recognition that love requires action as well as sentiment. My grandmother's care is not conditional upon convenience, and neither is my gratitude." Something shifted in his expression, a softening perhaps, or the dissolution of some barrier he had maintained between them. "You possess an unusual capacity for loyalty, Miss Gray. In my experience, such devotion is increasingly rare in a world that prioritizes personal advancement above all other considerations." "And yet," she replied, emboldened by something in his tone, "you seem to have constructed your entire existence around the pursuit of such advancement. Do you not find it lonely at the summit you have achieved?" The question hung between them like a challenge, and she immediately regretted its boldness. Alexander Blackwood was not a man who invited personal observation, and she had transgressed boundaries that should have remained inviolate. Yet instead of the icy rebuke she expected, his response carried a note of something approaching vulnerability. "Loneliness," he said slowly, "is the price one pays for refusing to compromise with mediocrity. I have learned that dependence upon others leads inevitably to disappointment, and that the only person whose capabilities one can truly trust is oneself." "That is a bleak philosophy," she observed, recognizing in his words echoes of her own struggles with trust and independence. "But a practical one," he countered. "I have built this empire through reliance upon my own judgment and abilities. Emotional attachments are luxuries I cannot afford." "And yet," she said quietly, "you trusted me with the Munich negotiation. Was that not a form of dependence?" The observation struck him like a physical blow, and she could see him grappling with its implications. For a man who prided himself on self-sufficiency, the acknowledgement that he had placed crucial business interests in another's hands represented a crack in the foundation of his worldview. "That was necessity," he said finally, though his tone lacked conviction. "Circumstances required delegation, nothing more." "If you say so," she replied, allowing a note of gentle skepticism to color her words. Their conversations began to take on an increasingly personal character as the weeks passed, though both maintained the pretense that these exchanges were purely professional in nature. Alexander spoke of his business philosophy with the passion of a true believer, revealing glimpses of the brilliant mind that had transformed a modest inheritance into a commercial empire. Yet beneath the surface confidence, Evangeline detected hints of something darker, a weariness that spoke of victories won at tremendous cost, of relationships sacrificed upon the altar of ambition. For her part, she found herself sharing aspects of her history that she had never discussed with anyone, drawn out by his unexpected capacity for listening and by the recognition that beneath his formidable exterior lay a loneliness that mirrored her own. She told him of her struggles to complete her education while working multiple jobs, of the nights spent caring for her grandmother through illness and decline, of the dreams she had set aside in favor of survival's harsh imperatives. "You speak of sacrifice as though it were natural law," he observed one evening as they worked through financial projections that would determine the fate of thousands of employees. "Do you never resent the paths not taken, the opportunities foregone in service to duty?" "Resentment," she replied, "is a luxury I cannot afford. It changes nothing and merely poisons whatever satisfaction one might derive from present circumstances." He studied her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see through all pretense and artifice. "You are either the most admirably selfless person I have encountered, or you have become expert at deceiving yourself about the nature of your desires." "Perhaps," she said, meeting his eyes with steady resolve, "the distinction is less important than the results achieved." It was during this period of growing intimacy, though neither would have admitted to such a thing, that an incident occurred which would fundamentally alter the trajectory of their relationship. Evangeline had remained late to complete a presentation that Alexander required for an early morning meeting, working by the light of her desk lamp as the city glittered in darkness beyond the windows. She was so absorbed in her work that she failed to notice his approach until his voice, carrying an unusual note of concern, broke the silence. "Miss Gray, it is nearly midnight. This level of dedication, while admirable, borders on the excessive." She looked up to find him standing beside her desk, having shed his suit jacket and loosened his tie in a gesture toward informality that was unprecedented in their professional relationship. The sleeves of his white shirt were rolled back, revealing forearms that spoke of carefully maintained physical fitness, and his dark hair showed signs of the distraction that indicated deep concentration. "The Peterson analysis requires completion before morning," she replied, attempting to maintain professional composure despite the unusual intimacy of the moment. "I would prefer to ensure accuracy rather than haste." "At the expense of your health and well-being?" he asked, and she was startled by the genuine concern in his voice. "Even the most dedicated employee requires rest." "I am quite capable of managing my own limitations," she said, though the words came out more sharply than she intended. He moved around her desk, ostensibly to examine her work, but she was acutely aware of his proximity, of the subtle fragrance of his cologne, and the controlled power that seemed to emanate from his presence. When he leaned forward to study her computer screen, his hand came to rest upon the back of her chair, and she felt an unexpected tremor of awareness course through her. "Your analysis is exceptional," he said quietly, his voice now carrying undertones that had nothing to do with business evaluation. "The Peterson account could not be in more capable hands." She turned to respond and found herself face to face with him, close enough to see the gold flecks that illuminated his dark eyes, close enough to feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek. The moments stretched between them like a taut wire, electric with possibilities neither had acknowledged and both understood. "Mr. Blackwood," she whispered, though whether in warning or invitation even she could not have said. "Alexander," he corrected, his voice rough with an emotion she dared not name. The space between them seemed to diminish without conscious movement from either party, drawn together by forces that defied rational explanation. She could see her own reflection in his eyes, could feel the rapid beating of her heart that seemed to echo in the charged silence of the office. It was at that moment that the telephone rang, shattering the spell with its insistent electronic shriek. Alexander stepped back as though awakening from a dream, his expression transforming from vulnerable intimacy to professional composure with bewildering speed. "Blackwood Industries," he answered, his voice once again carrying the cool authority that had made him legendary in corporate circles. The call concerned some minor crisis that required his immediate attention, and by the time it was concluded, the moment of dangerous intimacy had passed like a fever dream. Yet something had changed between them. Some boundary had been crossed that could not be uncrossed, and both were acutely aware that their relationship had entered uncharted and potentially treacherous territory. "You should go home, Miss Gray," Alexander said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "The Peterson analysis can wait until morning." "As you wish," she replied, gathering her belongings with movements that felt strangely disconnected from conscious thought. As she prepared to leave, he spoke again, his voice carrying a weight that suggested the words had been carefully chosen. "Evangeline," he said, using her given name for the first time, "what happened here tonight? Such boundaries must be maintained for the sake of professional propriety." "Of course," she agreed, though her heart rebelled against the cold practicality of his words. "It was merely a moment of fatigue-induced confusion. Takite." Yet as she walked through the empty corridors toward the elevator, she carried with her the memory of his touch, the warmth of his breath, the vulnerable humanity she had glimpsed beneath his carefully constructed armor. And she suspected that despite his words about boundaries and propriety, Alexander Blackwood was experiencing a similar struggle between reason and emotion, duty and desire. The game between them had changed, though neither would acknowledge it openly. They were no longer simply employer and employee, but two souls circling each other like binary stars, drawn together by forces they could not fully control or completely resist. The weeks that followed their moment of dangerous intimacy were marked by a peculiar tension that permeated every interaction between them, like electricity in the air before a thunderstorm. Alexander retreated behind walls of professional formality, so rigid they might have been constructed of marble and steel, addressing her with the cool courtesy one might reserve for a valued but distant business associate. Yet Evangeline, possessed of that particular feminine intuition that perceives truth beneath surface appearances, detected in his very coldness evidence of the struggle being waged within his soul. She observed the way his fingers would pause momentarily when passing documents to her, careful to avoid even the most casual contact. She noticed how his eyes would linger upon her face when he thought her attention was elsewhere, studying her with an intensity that spoke of fascination rather than mere professional evaluation. Most telling of all, she perceived the subtle changes in his behavior that suggested her presence had become a source of both comfort and disturbance to his carefully ordered existence. The coffee that appeared at her desk each morning was prepared exactly to her preferences, though she had never voiced them aloud. When she mentioned in passing that her grandmother had expressed a fondness for a particular variety of flowers, a magnificent bouquet appeared in the office reception area the following day, ostensibly for decorative purposes, though the blooms were precisely those she had described. These small gestures might have been dismissed as coincidental kindness, but their frequency and specificity suggested a mind that was paying far closer attention to her words and needs than professional necessity required. For her part, Evangeline found herself caught in a web of conflicting emotions that threatened to undermine the careful composure she had cultivated over years of adversity. The memory of that night haunted her thoughts with persistent clarity. The warmth of his breath against her cheek, the vulnerability she had glimpsed in his eyes, the electric tension that had drawn them together like magnetized elements. She told herself repeatedly that such thoughts were folly, that Alexander Blackwood existed in a sphere so far removed from her own that any romantic consideration was not merely impractical, but absurd. Yet the heart, that most irrational of organs, refused to be governed by logic or prudence. She found herself studying his profile during meetings, noting the way sunlight caught the gold highlights in his dark hair, the aristocratic curve of his jaw, the controlled power that seemed to emanate from his every movement. When he smiled, those rare moments when genuine amusement broke through his customary reserve, she felt an answering warmth bloom within her chest that had nothing to do with professional satisfaction and everything to do with emotions she dared not name. The crisis that would force these unspoken feelings into the open began with a seemingly routine business dinner, one of those elaborate affairs designed to cement relationships with potential investors. Alexander, despite his legendary social skills, had always harbored a particular distaste for such events, viewing them as necessary evils that required the deployment of charm as calculated and artificial as stage makeup. "The Worthington reception," he announced with the tone one might use to describe a particularly unpleasant medical procedure. "I require your attendance to manage the evening's logistics and ensure that conversations remain focused on substantive matters rather than social pleasantries." Evangeline accepted this assignment with her customary competence, though privately she wondered at the wisdom of placing herself in such close proximity to a man whose very presence had begun to affect her equilibrium. The event was to be held at one of the city's most exclusive venues, a Gothic mansion that had been transformed into a private club, catering to those whose wealth and influence placed them beyond the concerns of ordinary mortals. She selected her attire with the careful consideration of a general planning a campaign, choosing a dress of midnight blue silk that spoke of understated elegance rather than ostentation. The garment's modest neckline and conservative length proclaimed her professional status, while its expert tailoring suggested a woman confident in her own worth, a delicate balance that required considerable skill to achieve. When Alexander saw her that evening, something shifted in his expression, a moment of appreciation so profound that it transcended mere aesthetic admiration and entered the realm of genuine recognition. She saw him take in every detail of her appearance with the focused intensity he typically reserved for complex business negotiations, and for an instant, the careful barriers between them seemed to dissolve entirely. "You look," he began, then paused as though searching for words adequate to his meaning. "Exceptionally professional," he concluded, though his tone suggested that professionalism was only a small part of his observation. "Thank you," she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I trust my appearance will reflect appropriately upon the company's reputation." The evening proceeded with the ritualized precision of a diplomatic reception, each conversation carefully orchestrated to advance specific business objectives while maintaining the fiction of social pleasure. Evangeline moved through the gathering with practiced grace, facilitating introductions, managing schedules, and ensuring that her employer's needs were anticipated and met with seamless efficiency. Yet as the hours passed, she became aware of an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with business concerns. She noticed the way certain women regarded Alexander with barely concealed interest, their smiles carrying invitations that went far beyond professional collaboration. More disturbing still, she observed his responses to these overtures, courteous but not dismissive, engaged but not encouraging, maintaining precisely that degree of interest necessary to preserve business relationships while avoiding personal entanglements. The evening's most significant challenge came in the form of Victoria Ashford, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her reputation for ruthless ambition and strategic romantic conquests. Heir to a banking fortune and possessor of connections that could prove invaluable to Blackwood Industries, she represented exactly the sort of alliance that Alexander's business instincts would normally find irresistible. "Alexander, darling," she purred, approaching him with the confident sensuality of one accustomed to masculine capitulation. "How delightful to see you again. I was just telling Daddy about your innovative approach to the Henderson acquisition." He's most interested in discussing potential collaboration opportunities. Evangeline watched this exchange from across the room, her professional responsibilities temporarily forgotten as she observed the subtle interplay between them. Victoria possessed all the qualities that logic suggested would appeal to a man of Alexander's sophistication, beauty, wealth, social position, and the sort of ambition that complemented rather than challenged masculine authority. "Miss Ashford," Alexander replied with his customary courtesy, though Evangeline detected a note of something approaching wariness in his tone. "Your father's insights would be most welcome. Perhaps we might arrange a more formal discussion at a convenient time." "Oh, business can wait until tomorrow," Victoria laughed, moving closer to him with the practiced grace of a predator closing in on prey. "Tonight is for pleasure, surely. I was hoping you might escort me to the Pemberton yacht party next weekend. It promises to be the social event of the season." It was at this moment that Evangeline experienced an emotion so powerful and unexpected that it left her momentarily breathless. Jealousy, raw, primitive, and utterly irrational, coursed through her veins like liquid fire, transforming her careful composure into something far more dangerous and uncontrolled. The sight of Victoria's perfectly manicured hand resting upon Alexander's arm, the intimate tone of her voice, the assumption of familiarity in her manner, all combined to produce a reaction that revealed the depth of feelings Evangeline had been desperately trying to deny. She forced herself to look away, to focus upon the mundane tasks that justified her presence at this gathering, but the image remained seared upon her consciousness like a brand. When she looked again, she found Alexander's eyes upon her, his expression unreadable but somehow intense, as though he were gauging her reaction to Victoria's obvious interest. The evening's turning point came during what should have been a routine moment. Evangeline was reviewing the schedule for the following day when Victoria, apparently emboldened by wine and social success, made a comment that cut through the veneer of professional courtesy like a blade through silk. "How fortunate you are, Alexander, to have found such a competent assistant," she said, her tone carrying just enough condescension to make her meaning unmistakable. "So difficult to find reliable help these days. I'm sure she's most grateful for the opportunity to work in such elevated circumstances." The words struck Evangeline like a physical blow, not merely for their obvious slight, but for the casual assumption of superiority they represented. In that moment, all the years of struggle, all the sacrifices and compromises necessary to survive in a world that judged worth by privilege rather than character, crystallized into a moment of perfect, clarifying rage. "Indeed," she replied with a smile that carried all the warmth of Arctic winter. "Gratitude is such an important quality in any relationship, don't you think? Though I've found that competence tends to be reciprocal, one generally receives the level of respect one has earned through actual accomplishment, rather than inherited circumstance." Now, the silence that followed her words was electric with tension, every conversation in their immediate vicinity seeming to pause as the assembled guests registered the subtle but unmistakable challenge she had issued. Victoria's face flushed with an anger that transformed her beauty into something sharp and dangerous, while Alexander's expression shifted from surprise to something that might have been admiration. "How refreshing," Victoria said finally, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "to encounter such spirited service personnel. I'm sure your employer appreciates such loyalty." "He does," Alexander interjected before Evangeline could respond, his voice carrying an authority that cut through the social maneuvering like a sword through silk. "Miss Gray's capabilities extend far beyond the typical parameters of her position. Her insights have proven invaluable to several major negotiations, and her judgment is something I have come to rely upon completely." The public nature of his defense struck both women with equal force, though for vastly different reasons. Victoria realized that her attempt to diminish Evangeline had not only failed, but had revealed her own petty nature before an audience of influential observers. More significantly, Alexander's words constituted a declaration of professional and perhaps personal support that went far beyond conventional employer courtesy. Evangeline felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with social triumph and everything to do with the recognition that Alexander had chosen to defend her honor at potential cost to valuable business relationships. The gesture spoke of something deeper than professional appreciation, though she dared not examine too closely what that something might be. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of strained civility and carefully managed conversations, but the dynamic between all three participants had shifted irreversibly. Victoria's interest in Alexander took on a more calculating quality, as though she were reassessing both the challenge he presented and the obstacles that might impede her objectives. Alexander's manner toward Evangeline carried new notes of something approaching personal regard, while maintaining the careful boundaries that propriety demanded. As they prepared to leave the reception, Victoria made one final attempt to assert her position, approaching Alexander with the sort of intimate confidence that suggested private understanding. "I do hope you'll reconsider my invitation for next weekend," she murmured, her voice pitched for his ears alone, though Evangeline was close enough to overhear. "I think we could find much to discuss that would prove mutually beneficial." Alexander's response was delivered with the courteous finality that marked his most decisive business rejections. "I'm afraid my schedule is quite demanding at present. Perhaps another time." As they walked to the waiting car, the city's lights creating a backdrop of urban elegance, Evangeline found herself struggling with emotions she could neither fully understand nor adequately suppress. The evening had revealed depths to her feelings that she had been determined to deny, while simultaneously demonstrating that Alexander's regard for her extended beyond the purely professional realm. "Your response to Miss Ashford was spirited," he observed as they settled into the leather seats of his Mercedes, his tone carefully neutral, though she detected undertones of something approaching approval. "Perhaps too spirited," she replied, suddenly aware that her defense of dignity had potentially damaged important business relationships. "I hope my words did not compromise valuable opportunities." "On the contrary," he said, turning to face her with an expression that seemed to illuminate the space between them. "Your integrity was precisely what the situation required. Victoria Ashford's interest in my company extends only to its potential value to her own agenda. Your loyalty, by contrast, appears to be motivated by principles rather than calculation." The word loyalty hung between them with unexpected weight, carrying implications that neither was quite prepared to explore. Evangeline found herself studying his profile in the shifting light of passing street lamps, noting the sharp plane of his jaw, the controlled strength of his hands as they rested upon his knees, the way shadows and illumination played across features that had become disturbingly familiar and infinitely compelling. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, then paused as she realized she was about to venture into territory that professional wisdom warned her to avoid. "Alexander," he corrected gently, using the intimacy of his given name as he had that night in the office when boundaries had nearly dissolved entirely. "Alexander," she repeated, the name feeling strange and wonderful upon her tongue. "This evening has made me realize that our professional relationship has perhaps evolved beyond conventional parameters." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed upon the city landscape passing beyond the windows, but she could sense the intensity of thought occurring behind his composed exterior. "Yes," he said finally, his voice carrying a weight of recognition and perhaps regret. "It has indeed evolved in ways that neither of us anticipated or planned." "And what?" she asked with the courage that desperation sometimes provides. "Do you believe we should do about that evolution?" The question hung in the air between them, like a challenge to fate itself, and Evangeline felt the strange conviction that his answer would determine not merely the future of their professional association, but the entire trajectory of both their lives. Alexander turned to face her fully, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that seemed to strip away all pretense and artifice, leaving only the essential truth of what had grown between them, despite every effort to prevent it. "I believe," he said slowly, as though each word required careful consideration, "that we have entered territory that is both dangerous and inevitable. The question is whether we possess the courage to explore it, or the wisdom to retreat while retreat remains possible." The car had stopped before her modest apartment building, but neither made any move to end the conversation. They sat in the intimate darkness, surrounded by leather and luxury, but isolated from the world beyond the tinted windows, two souls poised upon the brink of a decision that would change everything or leave them forever wondering what might have been. The morning that followed their charged conversation in the car brought with it a peculiar quality of light, pale and ethereal, as though the very atmosphere had been transformed by the weight of unspoken acknowledgements. Evangeline arrived at the office with the punctuality that had become her trademark, yet she carried herself with a new awareness of the undercurrents that now flowed between herself and Alexander, like invisible rivers of possibility and peril. He was already present when she entered, standing before the great windows that offered their panoramic view of the city, his silhouette etched against the morning sky with the sharp precision of a figure carved from obsidian. The formal suit that armored his tall frame spoke of professional authority, yet something in his posture suggested a man wrestling with decisions that transcended the merely commercial realm. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carefully modulated to convey nothing beyond professional courtesy, though the effort required to maintain such neutrality was considerable. He turned at the sound of her voice, and she was struck immediately by the change in his countenance. The carefully constructed mask of corporate invulnerability had been replaced by something more human and infinitely more complex, an expression that spoke of sleepless contemplation and the sort of internal warfare that wages itself in the darkest hours before dawn. "Evangeline," he said, and the use of her given name sent tremors through her composure like seismic shifts in previously stable ground. "I trust you slept well as circumstances permitted," she replied, though the truth was that sleep had proven as elusive as morning mist, driven away by thoughts that circled endlessly around the implications of their conversation and the dangerous territory they had acknowledged entering. "Indeed," he murmured, and in that single word she heard the echo of her own restless night. "Perhaps we should discuss the parameters of our evolved situation." The phrase hung in the air between them with the weight of a diplomatic treaty, formal yet fraught with significance that extended far beyond its surface meaning. Evangeline felt her pulse quicken as she recognized that this conversation would either establish new boundaries or obliterate the remaining ones entirely. "I believe," she said carefully, "that such a discussion would be prudent." Alexander moved from the window to his desk with the controlled grace that characterized all his actions. Yet she detected in his movements a tension that spoke of carefully contained energy-seeking release. He did not seat himself behind the mahogany barrier that symbolized his authority, but rather leaned against its edge in a gesture toward informality that was unprecedented in their professional relationship. "Last evening," he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of one who has rehearsed difficult words until they achieve the appearance of spontaneity, "certain truths became impossible to ignore. The nature of my regard for you has evolved beyond the conventional boundaries of employer and employee." The admission struck her like lightning, illuminating a landscape previously shrouded in darkness, revealing familiar terrain transformed by sudden visibility. Yet even as her heart leaped at his words, her mind counseled caution, reminding her of the vast differences in their circumstances and the potential consequences of acknowledging feelings that defied practical wisdom. "And the nature of my regard for you," she replied with a courage that surprised even herself, "has undergone a similar transformation." though I fear the wisdom of acknowledging such evolution." "Wisdom," Alexander repeated, and something that might have been bitter amusement flickered across his features. "I have built my entire existence upon the foundation of practical wisdom, yet I find myself contemplating actions that contradict every principle of prudent behavior." He moved closer to her, close enough that she could perceive the subtle fragrance of his cologne and the controlled power that seemed to emanate from his presence like heat from a forge. When he spoke again, his voice carried undertones that resonated through her very bones. "I am not a man given to romantic fantasies, Evangeline. My life has been constructed upon the bedrock of rational calculation and strategic planning. Yet your presence in my world has introduced elements that resist all attempts at logical analysis." "And what elements are those?" she asked, though her voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "The way you challenge my assumptions without challenging my authority. The manner in which you anticipate my needs while maintaining your own integrity. The fact that your smile, rare though it is, has the power to transform my perception of entire days." His dark eyes held hers with an intensity that seemed to penetrate to her very soul. "Most disturbing of all, the growing recognition that your absence from my life would constitute a loss that no amount of professional success could compensate." The words fell between them like stones cast into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. Evangeline felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming recognition of emotions too powerful for ordinary expression. "Alexander," she breathed, and in speaking his name, she felt as though she were crossing some invisible threshold from which there could be no return. "I am aware," he continued, his voice now rough with emotion he no longer attempted to conceal, "of the practical obstacles that such feelings present, the difference in our social positions, the potential complications for both our careers, the gossip and speculation that would inevitably follow any public acknowledgement of personal attachment. And yet," she said, finding strength in the very acknowledgement of these difficulties, "you speak of such feelings as though they were established facts rather than dangerous possibilities." "Because," he replied, with the finality of one who has examined all alternatives and found them wanting, "I can no longer pretend that they are anything other than established facts. The question is not whether these feelings exist, but whether we possess the courage to act upon them, despite the consequences." The silence that followed his declaration stretched between them like a bridge spanning an abyss, and Evangeline felt herself standing upon its center, balanced between the safety of denial and the terrifying promise of acknowledgement. Every principle of self-preservation warned her to retreat, to reconstruct the professional barriers that had protected them both from this moment of dangerous honesty. Yet, as she studied his face, noting the vulnerability that shadowed his dark eyes, the tension that drew his mouth into lines of barely controlled longing, the way his hands trembled almost imperceptibly with the effort of maintaining distance, she realized that retreat was no longer possible. The territory they had entered could not be abandoned without devastating consequences for them both. "I am frightened," she admitted, with an honesty that stripped away all pretense. "Not of you, but of the power of what I feel when I am near you. I have spent my entire adult life constructing careful defenses against exactly such feelings, believing them to be luxuries I could not afford." "Dee and I," Alexander replied, "have convinced myself that emotional attachment represents weakness, that the sort of vulnerability required for genuine intimacy is incompatible with the demands of leadership and success. Yet here we stand," she observed, "acknowledging feelings that contradict everything we have told ourselves about prudence and practicality." "Here we stand indeed," he agreed, and moved closer still, so close that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the gold flecks that illuminated his dark eyes like stars in a midnight sky. When he reached out to touch her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek with a reverence that spoke of months of suppressed longing, She felt her careful composure dissolve like morning frost in sunshine. The touch was electric, sending currents of sensation through every nerve ending, awakening responses she had never experienced and barely understood. "Evangeline," he whispered, her name becoming both prayer and promise upon his lips. "Yes," she replied, though the word contained multitudes. Yes to the question in his eyes, yes to the dangerous path they were choosing, yes to the terrifying and wonderful prospect of surrendering to feelings that had grown too powerful for denial. When his lips met hers, it was with the controlled passion of a man who had held himself in check for too long, who had finally reached the breaking point of his own careful restraint. The kiss was both tender and desperate, speaking of months of suppressed desire and the profound relief of finally giving voice to emotions too powerful for silence. Time seemed to suspend itself around them, the office fading into irrelevance, as they discovered in each other's arms the fulfillment of longings neither had dared acknowledge. Yet, even in the midst of this overwhelming moment, both retained enough awareness to recognize that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, that whatever happened next would forever alter the landscape of their lives. When they finally separated, both breathing as though they had been running great distances, the silence was charged with new understanding and infinite possibility. Alexander's hands remained upon her shoulders, as though he feared that releasing her would cause this moment to dissolve into mere fantasy. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice carrying all the uncertainty and hope that such moments inevitably produce. "Now," he replied, his own voice rough with emotion, "we discover whether two people from such different worlds can build something together that honors both their individual integrity and their shared feelings." It was then that the intercom's harsh electronic intrusion shattered the intimacy of their moment. Mrs. Henderson's voice, carrying news that would test their newfound understanding in ways neither could have anticipated. "Mr. Blackwood," came the carefully controlled tone that suggested crisis of significant proportions. "I'm afraid there's been a development that requires your immediate attention. The Henderson account has encountered difficulties that could jeopardize the entire acquisition." Alexander's transformation from vulnerable lover to commanding executive was so rapid and complete that Evangeline might have questioned the reality of their previous intimacy, save for the lingering warmth of his touch upon her skin and the promise that still burned in his dark eyes. "Details," he commanded, his voice once again carrying the authority that had made him legendary in corporate circles. "It appears that certain personal information about key executives has been leaked to competitors, information that could only have come from someone with intimate access to confidential files." The implications struck both of them simultaneously, the suggestion of betrayal from within, the potential destruction of months of careful negotiation, the possibility that their personal moment had occurred at precisely the time when professional crisis demanded absolute focus and dedication. "Assemble the senior staff immediately," Alexander ordered, his manner conveying urgency without panic. "I want a complete analysis of potential security breaches and a strategy for damage control within the hour." As Mrs. Henderson acknowledged his instructions and ended the call, Alexander turned back to Evangeline with an expression that somehow managed to combine professional determination with personal regret. "It seems that fate has chosen to test our newfound understanding immediately," he said with grim humor. "The next few hours will determine not only the future of a major business acquisition, but whether we can maintain what we have discovered between ourselves amid the pressures of crisis management. Then we shall discover together," she replied with the quiet confidence that had first drawn him to her. "Or whatever challenges arise, they need not diminish what has passed between us unless we allow them to do so." The crisis that unfolded over the following hours proved to be more complex and threatening than either had initially imagined. The leaked information was not merely embarrassing personal details, but strategic intelligence that could undermine Blackwood Industries' position in several ongoing negotiations. More troubling still, the precision and timing of the leak suggested involvement from someone with access to Alexander's most confidential communications. As they worked side by side to contain the damage and identify the source of betrayal, Evangeline found herself experiencing a new dimension of their partnership. The personal intimacy they had acknowledged seemed to enhance rather than complicate their professional collaboration, creating an understanding that transcended verbal communication. She anticipated his needs with uncanny accuracy, while he trusted her judgment in ways that went far beyond conventional delegation of authority. Yet, beneath the surface of their effective crisis management lay currents of tension that had nothing to do with business concerns. Every accidental touch sent electricity through both their systems. Every shared glance carried undertones that had nothing to do with strategic planning. Every moment of proximity served as a reminder of feelings that had been acknowledged but not yet fully explored. It was during the darkest hour of the crisis, when it appeared that months of careful work might be destroyed by this act of betrayal, that they received unexpected intelligence that would transform not only their understanding of the situation, but their perception of the forces arrayed against them. Victoria Ashford, it seemed, had been far more interested in Alexander's business affairs than either had realized, and her social positioning had provided her with access to information that she had used with devastating effectiveness. The revelation struck both of them with the force of personal betrayal, not merely because of the business damage inflicted, but because it represented an attack upon the very foundations of trust and integrity upon which their newfound intimacy had been built. "She used our conversation at the reception," Alexander said with quiet fury, studying the evidence that Mrs. Henderson had compiled with typical efficiency. "Details that I mentioned in passing, observations about competitor strategies that seemed harmless in social context. And used my defense of my position to identify me as someone whose loyalty she perceived as threatening to her own objectives," Evangeline added, recognizing in Victoria's machinations a calculated assault upon both their professional and personal relationship. The recognition that they faced not merely business competition, but personal attack served to strengthen rather than weaken the bond that had formed between them. In Victoria's betrayal, they found confirmation that what they had discovered together was worth defending against those who would use manipulation and deception to achieve their ends. As the crisis reached its resolution, through a combination of Alexander's strategic brilliance and Evangeline's diplomatic skills, both realized that they had passed through fire together and emerged not merely unscathed, but somehow purified and strengthened by the experience. "We make an effective team," Alexander observed, as they reviewed the final reports that confirmed the successful containment of Victoria's assault upon their business interests. "In all respects," Evangeline replied, meeting his eyes with a confidence that encompassed both professional capability and personal commitment. The future that stretched before them remained uncertain, fraught with challenges that would test both their professional partnership and their personal feelings. Yet as they stood together in the office that had witnessed the evolution of their relationship from employer and employee to something far more profound and dangerous, both felt the quiet confidence that whatever storms might come, they would weather them together. The months that followed Victoria's exposure and subsequent disgrace were marked by a transformation so profound that those who had known Alexander Blackwood in his previous incarnation might have questioned whether some fundamental alteration of character had occurred. Yet to Evangeline, who had come to understand the man beneath the corporate armor, the changes represented not transformation, but revelation, the emergence of qualities that had always existed, but had been buried beneath years of careful self-protection and ruthless ambition. Their relationship evolved with the gradual inevitability of seasons changing, each day bringing new discoveries about the depths of feeling that two souls could achieve when barriers of pride and circumstance were gradually dismantled. Alexander's legendary inflexibility gave way to a consideration for her thoughts and feelings that extended far beyond professional courtesy, while Evangeline found herself revealing aspects of her character that years of independence and self-reliance had taught her to guard as precious secrets. The office that had once been a theater of corporate warfare became something approaching a sanctuary, where the mundane requirements of business provided a framework for the exploration of emotions that defied categorization or easy expression. They worked together with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural, anticipating each other's needs and thoughts with the uncanny accuracy of minds that had learned to operate in perfect harmony. Yet beneath this surface tranquility lay currents of passion that grew stronger with each passing day, fed by the constant proximity that their professional relationship demanded and the growing recognition that what they had discovered together transcended mere romantic attraction. They were, in the truest sense, kindred spirits who had found in each other not merely love but completion, two halves of a whole that had been seeking reunion across the vast distances of circumstance and social convention. The crisis that would test the ultimate strength of their bond came not from external enemies or business competitors, but from the most unexpected source imaginable. Evangeline's grandmother, the woman who had raised her with such devotion and sacrifice, suffered a sudden deterioration in health that required immediate and extensive medical intervention. The doctors believe she may have suffered a series of small strokes, Evangeline explained to Alexander one grey morning, her voice carrying the controlled anguish of one who faces the potential loss of everything that has given life meaning. The treatments they recommend are extensive and expensive, far beyond what my insurance will cover. Alexander listened to her explanation with the focused attention he typically reserved for matters of crucial business importance. Yet his expression carried something far more personal than professional concern. When she finished speaking, he was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that seemed to measure the depths of her distress. "How much?" he asked simply. "More than I could earn in several years," she replied, her voice breaking slightly despite her efforts to maintain composure. "I have been exploring options, but the treatments must begin immediately if they are to have any hope of success." "Consider it done," Alexander said with the quiet finality that characterized his most important decisions. "I cannot accept such generosity," Evangeline protested, though her heart rebelled against the pride that demanded such refusal. "The sum involved would place me in your debt for the remainder of my life." "Debt?" Alexander repeated, rising from his chair to stand before her with an expression that combined tenderness with something approaching indignation. "You speak of debt as though love operates according to the principles of commercial transaction." The word hung between them with the weight of final revelation, spoken aloud for the first time, though it had lived in their hearts for months. Love, that most dangerous and wonderful of human emotions, acknowledged at last in all its terrifying and magnificent reality. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice carrying all the wonder and fear that such moments inevitably produce. "I love you, Evangeline Gray," he said with the conviction of one who has wrestled with truth until surrender becomes inevitable. "I love your courage, your integrity, your refusal to be diminished by circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. I love the way you challenge me to be better than I believed possible, and the way you accept me despite the flaws that others fear or despise." Tears gathered in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of hearing spoken the words her heart had longed to hear, yet had never dared expect. "And I love you," she replied, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I love your brilliance, your passion, the vulnerability you show only to me. I love the man you are beneath the armor you wear to protect yourself from a world that has taught you to expect betrayal." When he took her in his arms this time, It was with the certainty of one who has found his home after years of wandering in foreign territories. Their kiss spoke not merely of passion, but of recognition, two souls acknowledging the miracle of perfect compatibility discovered against all odds and social expectation. "Marry me," he said when they finally separated, the words emerging with the spontaneous honesty of ultimate truth. "Not because of gratitude or obligation, but because I cannot imagine a future that does not include you as my partner in all things." The proposal struck her like lightning, illuminating a landscape she had never dared explore, revealing possibilities that her practical mind had dismissed as impossible fantasies. Yet even as her heart leaped with joy, her conscience demanded honesty about the obstacles that such a union would inevitably face. "The differences in our circumstances," she began, but he silenced her with a gesture, "are irrelevant compared to the similarity of our souls," he said firmly. "You have taught me that true worth cannot be measured by inheritance or social position, but by character and courage. Any society that would judge our union by external standards is not worthy of our consideration. Your business associates, your social circle, they will never accept someone of my background," she protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Then they will be replaced by those who possess the wisdom to recognize quality when they encounter it," Alexander replied, with the implacable determination that had built his empire. "I have spent too many years conforming to expectations that brought me neither happiness nor fulfillment. I will not sacrifice the greatest gift life has offered for the approval of people whose opinions I neither value nor respect." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Henderson, whose expression carried news of such significance that both recognized immediately that their personal moment had collided with events beyond their control. "Mr. Blackwood," she said with the careful formality that masked deep emotion, "I've just received word from the hospital. Miss Gray's grandmother has taken a turn for the worse. The doctors recommend immediate family presence." The next hours passed in a blur of urgent travel, medical consultations, and the peculiar suspension of normal time that occurs when life hangs in the balance. Alexander remained at Evangeline's side through it all, his presence providing strength and comfort that no amount of wealth or influence could have purchased. Eleanor Gray lay small and fragile in the hospital bed, her once strong hands now transparent as autumn leaves, her breathing shallow but steady. Yet when her eyes opened and focused upon Evangeline's face, they held all the love and wisdom that had shaped her granddaughter's character through years of struggle and triumph. "My dear child," she whispered, her voice barely audible yet carrying infinite tenderness, "you look happy, truly happy for the first time in years." "I am, grandmother," Evangeline replied, taking those frail hands in her own strong ones. "I have found unexpected joy." Eleanor's gaze shifted to Alexander, studying him with the penetrating assessment that belonged to one who had learned to read character through decades of experience with human nature in all its varieties. "So this is the man who has captured my granddaughter's heart," she said with a smile that transformed her worn features into something approaching their former beauty. "I can see why. There is strength in his face, but also kindness. Rare qualities in combination." "Mrs. Gray," Alexander said, moving closer to the bed with the respectful attention he might have shown to royalty, "your granddaughter is the most remarkable woman I have ever encountered. If you will give us your blessing, I intend to spend the remainder of my life ensuring her happiness. And will you love her, not despite her humble origins, but because of the character they have formed?" Eleanor asked, with the directness that age and approaching mortality permit. "I will love her," Alexander replied with quiet conviction, "because she has shown me what it means to live with purpose, beyond mere personal ambition. She has taught me that true wealth lies not in what one accumulates, but in what one gives of oneself to others." Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, then turned back to her granddaughter with a smile that seemed to illuminate the sterile hospital room. Then you have my blessing, child. Marry this man who sees your worth so clearly and build a life together that honors both love and responsibility. The wedding that took place 6 months later was a study in contrasts that somehow achieved perfect harmony. The ceremony was held in the small church where Eleanor Gray had worshipped for decades, a modest structure that could accommodate neither the elaborate displays of wealth that Alexander's position might have demanded, nor the social expectations of his former associates. Yet the simplicity of the setting served only to emphasize the profound significance of the vows being exchanged. Evangeline wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slender frame, but retaining the timeless elegance that had graced Eleanor's own wedding day. Alexander, magnificent in formal attire that spoke of quiet elegance rather than ostentatious display, stood beside her with an expression of such genuine happiness that even the most cynical observers found themselves moved by the obvious sincerity of his devotion. The guest list reflected the new priorities that had emerged from their union: employees who had worked with dedication and integrity, business associates who had proven themselves worthy of trust, and the small circle of friends who had supported both through the challenges of their unlikely courtship. Victoria Ashford's absence from the gathering was noted by some, though her disgrace had rendered her opinions irrelevant to those who truly mattered. Eleanor Gray, though weakened by her illness, insisted upon attending the ceremony that united her beloved granddaughter with the man who had won not only Evangeline's heart, but her own approval. She sat in the front pew wrapped in shawls that could not warm the frailty of advancing age, yet her eyes shone with a joy that seemed to illuminate her entire being. When Alexander and Evangeline exchanged vows that they had written themselves, promises that spoke not merely of love, but of partnership, mutual respect, and shared commitment to purposes beyond personal happiness, there was not a dry eye among the assembled witnesses. The words they spoke transcended conventional romantic sentiment, acknowledging instead the deeper truths they had discovered about the nature of authentic love and genuine compatibility. "I promise," Alexander said, his voice carrying across the small church with surprising strength, "to honor not only your heart, but your mind, not only your love, but your independence, not only your dreams, but your right to pursue them according to your own vision of fulfillment." And I promise," Evangeline replied, her own voice steady despite the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her composure, "to challenge you to remain true to your highest self, to support your ambitions while holding you accountable to principles that transcend mere success, and to love you not for what you can provide, but for who you choose to be." The kiss that sealed their union was witnessed by angels and mortals alike, a moment of perfect communion that seemed to stop time itself in recognition of love, triumphant over circumstance and social convention. The years that followed proved that their union represented far more than romantic fulfillment. It became a partnership that transformed not only their individual lives, but the very nature of Blackwood Industries itself. Under Evangeline's influence, the company evolved from a purely profit-driven enterprise to an organization that balanced commercial success with social responsibility, providing employment opportunities for those who might otherwise have been overlooked and supporting causes that addressed real human needs. Alexander's legendary ruthlessness gave way to a leadership style that combined uncompromising standards with genuine consideration for the welfare of those under his authority. His employees, accustomed to fear-based motivation, discovered that respect and appreciation could produce results that intimidation had never achieved. Evangeline, meanwhile, flourished in her role as true partner rather than mere assistant. Her insights shaped major business decisions. Her diplomatic skills opened doors that had previously remained closed, and her unwavering integrity became the moral compass that guided the company through ethical challenges that might have compromised lesser organizations. Eleanor Gray lived to see her granddaughter's transformation from struggling employee to beloved wife and respected business leader. Her final months brightened by the knowledge that the child she had raised with such devotion had found not only love, but purpose that extended far beyond personal fulfillment. When she passed peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning filled with birdsong and sunshine, both Alexander and Evangeline felt not merely grief, but profound gratitude for the woman whose wisdom and sacrifice had made their happiness possible. The memorial service held in the same small church where they had exchanged vows became a celebration of a life that had touched countless others through quiet acts of kindness and unwavering moral courage. Alexander's eulogy, delivered with an emotion that few had ever witnessed from him, spoke of Eleanor's legacy living on through her granddaughter's character and the principles that would guide their shared future. As they stood together beside Eleanor's grave in the peaceful cemetery where spring flowers bloomed in defiance of winter's passage, Alexander and Evangeline felt the strange comfort that comes from recognizing that love transcends even death, that the bonds formed through genuine affection and mutual respect continue to provide strength and guidance long after physical presence has ended. "She would be proud," Alexander said quietly, his arm around Evangeline's shoulders as they watched the sun set through the trees that sheltered Eleanor's final resting place. "She is proud," Evangeline corrected gently. "Love like hers doesn't end with death. It continues to shape and bless the lives it has touched." Years later, when business historians would analyze the transformation of Blackwood Industries from ruthless corporate predator to exemplar of ethical capitalism, they would point to various factors: market pressures, regulatory changes, evolving consumer expectations. Yet those closest to the situation understood that the real catalyst had been far simpler and more profound: the love between two people who had discovered that true partnership could achieve what individual ambition never could. Alexander Blackwood, once known as the impossible CEO whom no one could endure for a month, became instead a leader whom employees respected, competitors admired, and society recognized as a force for positive change. The transformation was not magic, but the natural result of a man finally understanding that strength shared is strength multiplied, that vulnerability accepted becomes invincibility achieved. And Evangeline, the headstrong young woman who had entered his office seeking only employment and survival, discovered that in winning his heart she had gained not merely love, but the opportunity to help transform one corner of the world into something more closely approximating what human relationships could achieve when built upon foundations of mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared commitment to purposes larger than personal gratification. Their story became legend within the industry, not as fairy tale romance, but as proof that authentic love, when combined with character and courage, possesses the power to transform not only individual lives, but entire organizations and the communities they serve. They had found in each other not merely happiness, but purpose, not merely companionship, but partnership in the truest sense of that often misused word. In the end, the greatest victory was neither romantic nor commercial, but moral. Two people had chosen to build something together that honored the best in both, while serving purposes that extended far beyond their own interests. In a world often cynical about the possibility of lasting love or meaningful change, they had proven that both remained not only possible, but inevitable when approached with honesty, courage, and unwavering commitment to principles that transcend expedience. As they stood together in the office where their journey had begun, now transformed by years of shared purpose into something approaching a sanctuary, both understood that they had achieved something rare and precious, a love that had made them not only happy, but better, not only fulfilled but useful, not only content but worthy of the trust that others had placed in their leadership. The city sprawled beyond their windows as it always had, but they saw it now through eyes that understood their responsibility to contribute to its improvement rather than merely extract profit from its opportunities. Their love had taught them that true success is measured not by what one accumulates, but by what one contributes, not by what one achieves for oneself, but by what one makes possible for others. In choosing each other, they had chosen to become the sort of people who make the world marginally better through their presence in it. That, perhaps, is the greatest love story of all. Two souls who find in their union not merely personal fulfillment, but the strength and purpose to serve causes larger than themselves, proving that love at its finest is both the most personal and the most universal of human experiences.